Well, hello. That's always nice to get applause ahead of time. It's very encouraging. I'm glad your hopes are up. Yeah, well, as mentioned, I want to go over some of the things I've been studying over the years about, particularly at large organizations, how they not only figure out what it means to have a culture, as we'll get to, that's helpful, but also how they transition over from their old culture or their old way of doing things into something new. And some of the kind of tactics that I've seen organizations follow so that hopefully it's helpful. Now, if you're like me, well, one, I have a medication regimen I can recommend to you. But if you're like me, you've studied a lot of DevOps things and followed it over the years. And this is sort of what you hear from everyone who talks about DevOps, right? That tools are fine. It's easy way back when to figure out what a puppet and a chef is. And nowadays, you know how to put things in containers and do whatever Istio may be and things like that, right? You can orchestrate all of these things. That's all easy. But it's these people that are hard and difficult. You know, software's easy, hardware's easy, but it's that meatware that's really hard to program, right? It comes with numerous manuals, not helpful ones, and it's really hard to debug over time. And oftentimes, people in the DevOps world get equated very closely with culture. I guess culture is the way that they operate and kind of their operating system. And I've always found, largely the previous talk excluded, which was fantastically detailed, but I've always found a discussion of what culture is very unsatisfying. It seems kind of like mystic and, I guess, true to meatware, squishy. And it's hard to kind of wrap my hands around what that means. And, you know, I always think about, especially after you see a talk or read a book, you go in on Monday, and it's kind of hard to figure out, like, well, what do I actually do with that? Because I know we should be doing good things that are good, and I'll enjoy each other's company, and we'll be creative and things like that. So that's what I've spent a couple of years, along with many other things, trying to figure out is what does culture actually mean, and how can we figure that out based on what organizations and people are actually doing, as opposed to only what we would desire that they do. So first of all, a little bit about myself. A long time ago, I did a lot of real work instead of just presentations and marketing and stuff, which I currently do for this company, Pivotal. And I used to be a developer for about 10 years or so at various places. And I've been an industry analyst at a little firm called Red Monk and 451 Research. And I used to write a column about DevOps for the Register. If you're interested in reading all of that fun, darkly humored stuff, I have the, as it's titled, Digital WTF book of columns up there you can check out. It's a fun sort of historic tour through my making fun of DevOps over the past 3 or 4 years, you know, because I love it so much. But more importantly, I recently finished up what O'Reilly likes to insultingly call a report to its authors. Us authors like to call it a book. But it's about 90 pages or so, and what I'm going to go over is a small section of it. But overall, what it covers is if you're in a large organization and you want to change how you're doing software, transform the monolith of your organization, it's a lot about what that meatware change and updating is, and we'll give you an overview based on case studies and organizations I've talked with. And if you happen to still be living in 2005 and you want to do security in Java, long ago I wrote a book about the Java Authentication and Authorization Service. Now, I don't know if you've written a book before, but like all books you end up writing about a technical topic, what that book led me to conclude is I hated that framework. It was very not cool. Anyways, you know, and there's my Twitter thing there. If you're really interested in these slides, I just put a link to them up there. And I do a couple of podcasts, Software Defined Talk and Pivotal Conversations. And, you know, you can check that stuff out if you like it. So anyways, just to give some context for why we care about these kinds of things, right? Like a couple of years ago, especially in the kind of like DevOps-y marketing world, this was sort of like the main way we would motivate people. Especially in a corporate context, as we would say, these robot dogs are coming from the West Coast to basically destroy your business. And the way they do that is with software, essentially. So they get really good at software, developing it and deploying it and running it, and they totally disrupt whatever that may mean what your business is. And this was a very motivating force for many, many years. But I think instead of it being kind of a dark thing where you just kind of like, you know, set fire to the city at the end of a long journey and everyone gets depressed. What has resulted in is it has really motivated people in all sorts of organizations, what you might call normal organizations, or if you work at some sort of startup, you could call them a boring organization. But they're the ones that we use every day. Just large organizations from militaries to insurance companies. I told you they were very exciting. To telcos and all sorts of organizations like that. And they've generally gotten really good at software. So what they've done is they realize that producing software, thinking about software as a product, as us vendors do, is key to thriving and actually improving the way they do their business. Now, there's some, depending on your position, kind of scary examples like I have a friend of mine who's signed up for a life insurance company where he gives them his Apple data, and over the course of 6 or 12 months, I think, it basically figures out discounts, or maybe not, to give him based on his healthy activity or not. And these things seem kind of obvious, but they're not things that regular organizations have really been able to do on a very quick, sort of even weekly basis over time. So just very briefly, the way that these organizations accomplish that, other than putting a DevOps culture in place, is they have a very disciplined product approach to software where every week or so, they come up with a new feature or set of features, they put it into production, they observe how people use it, and if it works, then they go in to solve another problem. And if it doesn't work, they refine that problem. And I kind of think of this as basically innovating, right? A very disciplined way of figuring out how to solve a problem and the right way to design and solve it. And if you're on a 12, 18-month cycle, or in the case of the military, 10 years, it's really hard to get the kind of fast improvement that you would want following that product development cycle. So as mentioned, getting to this point where you treat your software as a product, where every week you're given the chance to improve how your product is functioning and therefore change the way your business operates, it does require some amount of culture change, as we're told over time. And I guess what we're changing to, it's always good to know the enemy you're changing from, is more of a service mentality of IT that I definitely grew up with and I encounter all the time in the large organizations where you have sort of a set of requirements documented, always inexplicably on a Word document on like some SharePoint site that you have to figure out how to access. And you're given those as an IT department, as developers and infrastructure people, to basically deliver those requirements, to deliver on that project. And that kind of culture, if you will, that process is a lot different than this idea of every week you're delivering something new and you're discovering what it is your customers want to do. I guess to put it in a somewhat depressing way, it never ends, right? Like there's no end to your project. It's more of a continuous stream of releasing software. So anyways, the culture we want to get to is more of a sort of innovation, continuous culture that we're shooting for. Not really this like delivering on a set of requirements that we have and just delivering on that project. And I think that's a much different way of thinking and a much different way of doing jobs than we're used to in IT. So first of all, it's easy to confuse sort of the symptoms of the disease of culture with all these sort of artifacts that you see out there. All of them are great, except maybe those spooky feet down there. But back in my day, the symbol of a good functioning culture you wanted to work for was a dog under a desk, which I guess is nice, but that's not necessarily going to create good software for you. It might, sort of middling best case scenario make things smell a little weird. And of course, you've got your hipsters, and there's always lots of sticky notes, and you're going to have board games that people can play to drive camaraderie. And my favorite is there's always 10 ways of making coffee, right? Like you've got some scales and some way of measuring things. And definitely these sort of side effects tend to happen in a culture that is happy and functioning. I guess you could have a creative process that isn't happy and is just more like sad or just very like focused. I think that's kind of what that CrossFit culture is all about, as far as I know. You can tell I'm a thorough worker-outer. But in general, when you're thinking about software innovation, it's a lot more about having establishing the kind of place that would have 10 ways of making coffee. But again, you don't want to assume that if you just get like a box full of sticky notes, all of a sudden you're going to be making great software and avoiding robot dogs. So narrowing down a little bit more, just to kind of like quickly go through the path of what you might have encountered culture is and start to think about what it is so you can do something about it. I'm sure you've encountered I always pronounce it wrong, the Westrom model of culture, which I think is a great way to baseline the way your culture is, right? It doesn't necessarily tell you what to do about it. I mean, you can kind of interpolate from it. But it is a way to think about like, what kind of culture do we have in place, so therefore what work do we need to do? Or should I talk to Cote afterwards and find one of the jobs at Pivotal, which he will get like a $3,000 referral bonus for if I work there 90 days, knowing full well that on day 91 I can totally leave and he will not begrudge me. But obviously what you want to do, I don't know if you can tell by the names, but the left side is bad. Just so there's no confusion about that. And the middle side, like all mysterious bell curves, is probably where most people are, right? There's processes that you follow and known things that go along that have been successful. But it's not really like a generative, as it says, kind of creative thing. You're really encouraged to make stuff up and try new things. And clearly what you want to get to is that generative side, right? Like, look at all those great words up there. Messengers trained. I actually forget what that means. Oftentimes you don't need to train a messenger, but people are cooperating and failure's okay. Like all these great, awesome things that you want versus, like being punished, essentially. So again, this gives you a good baseline, but it doesn't quite get to, it doesn't demystify exactly what you do about culture. Now, thankfully, when I was kind of working through what culture was in my extensive research, if you remember, and I vaguely remember this because my dad suffered the consequences of this in the 90s. Boy, in the 90s, if you were a materials manager for a chip manufacturer, not cool. Not a good business to have been in, at least in the Western world. But back then, if you remember, there was like globalism and people were all freaked out. There was that movie, I think with Sean Connery, where like a good haircut American guy got cemented into a cement cylinder in Japan, which is also not very great. But there was a lot of research put into how do we change our organization over to be more competitive? How do we not just sort of stamp out all these cars that we have and learn from other cultures, not culture necessarily, but other organizations that are successful? So there's a tremendous amount of research put into it. And if you kind of dig into that research, and there's 2 references, I realize you can't click on those, but maybe later on you can. But what I like about these explanations, and also the rest of the book hanging around it, if you have time for things like books, is that it emphasizes this point that your existing culture is not necessarily bad, it's just what had been successful and it got you to where you are. And so you shouldn't necessarily be dismissive of it, but you want to think about what would you like to achieve, as we kind of heard a little bit about in the opening talk this morning. And how do we start wrapping a culture around that and figuring out what attributes we want and how we move people towards that, right? How do we, if you want to be snarky about it, how do we create the culture that 10 years from now we're going to call bad and want to dismantle, that has been successful and needs to change? So I think that gets us a lot closer to how I kind of sort down and thinking about culture is. I'm very simple. I got a lot going on in my life, so I try to keep things very simple. But I generally think when people talk about culture, it's a discussion of essentially how we do things around here, right? You might think of these as the norms or the practices or the process, but really it's both the written down and the kind of unwritten down assumptions about like, can we be 5 minutes late to a meeting, or am I more like Northern European and we have to be right on time to a meeting? Like, how do we think about how we do things? How do we sit and whiteboard and plan things out? How do we reward people? Again, it's really just like the sum of how you do stuff around the office. And so giving that idea of, one, you want to kind of program what your culture is and what it is, the set of things that you do. What I want to spend the rest of the time going over is what that goal is. What I've noticed, good cultures that rely on software to really start to run and improve the way they do their business, and therefore looking to be a product company and be more innovative, what kind of culture things they drive towards. And then also, when it comes especially to large organizations applying that culture, what are some of the good things and bad things, the tactics that organizations use to move to that more innovative-based way of doing things? So first of all, just to be responsible, like I mentioned, I used to do real work back when I programmed, but nowadays I just write things and make slides. I don't think I have any impressive animation in here to show you off my skills. But there's a lot of great other books to look at that I draw, in addition to talking with just people who are doing this in organizations. There's some good books to draw sort of research, if you will, from. And as mentioned earlier, Accelerate's actually a really great book. If you're really lazy, you could just read the most recent DevOps report for the past 2 years and kind of get the gist of it. But there's actually some really good write-ups in there and more in-depth about what culture means and how it fits into DevOps and kind of proof that it makes sense. And these are those 2 books that are from the era of dropping people into concrete pillars that kind of go over how U.S. and Western European people were trying to figure out how to be competitive. And then finally, I just finished reading this one. Depending on how closely you follow the news of big government disasters and overspending, you might have some take on it. But there's a great book by some of the people who worked in y'all's government digital services, kind of going over not only what culture is, but how you put in place a strategy to be better at software. And it's actually really fantastic. And then finally, if you want more of a how to survive and thrive in large organizations, these 2 books over here are very practical and almost dark in nature about how things actually work for good and bad in organizations. But all of those will give you a good idea of what culture is and how to start doing it in a large organization. So as I mentioned a couple of times, I'm always interested in beyond the team level, beyond one room of, let's say, 8 or 10 people, kind of figuring out on a daily basis over lunch or over those board games or swapping advice about which strange toe shoes to wear and how to keep them from smelling too bad. When you work in a larger organization, the problem very rapidly becomes scale, right? Like, how do I scale up these benefits that I have? And you see this even in the much hollowed Spotify culture talk. Like there was actually an article published today in the Register about a investigative report about what Amazon's culture is. And so I'm very eager to see if the Amazon culture and way of doing things will eclipse the Spotify way of doing things in sort of like conference popularity. So that'll be a fun thing to track over time. But as you can see, one of the things even Spotify struggles with is as we move beyond those how to defunkify your toe shoe sort of size teams, your 2 pizza teams, I guess. Which I think means American pizza. You might need more of those little European pizzas that I'm always eating down in Amsterdam. But as you scale up, as they've done, and you grow rapidly, how you sort of define and put those norms into place becomes quite the challenge. Now that's nice, as some might say, adorable. But the organizations that I study, I don't even know what order of magnitude that is, because I have a philosophy degree and I don't know math. But you can see at some place like JP Morgan Chase, a large bank, they've got essentially amongst about 40,000 people in the IT department, there's like 18,000 developers. And that's going to be hard to figure out how to define and scale that culture up, let alone change them from a sort of help desk way of doing things. So I think that is the key thing to getting maximum benefit from culture change is paying close attention to how do we scale it up? How do we think about managing that moving over and really treat it as a project, if you will, that leadership and management has to pay attention to. And I think that's the first thing in realizing how you change culture over and how you kind of fix up your process is it is extremely key at this scale is the manager's job, the leadership job, as they fancy calling themselves, or executives. I think leadership is defined by like, I guess a manager maybe manages one team and maybe a manager does 2 teams. And I think if you have like vice in your name, vice president, then that qualifies an executive. I'm always very, sort of fuzzy on what leadership is. But at this level of scale, it basically is a job that management needs to take on, which maybe is a relief for some of y'all. Y'all just have to sort of like, start doing the culture thing. You don't necessarily have to solve that problem for all 18,000 of the developers in your organization. So from that standpoint, let's look at the type of people that you want to put in place and the way that they think. Again, as let's think about it as a manager programming this organization, almost rewriting it at some point, right? And again, contrast this with the idea of like, here's a set of requirements, here's a set of needs that we have, figure out how to implement, deliver, and maintain the SLAs or the uptime around it. So the first thing, which should be obvious, but it kind of causes a lot of this, is the teams that we want to put in place when we're looking to do software. You essentially want them to be innovative, right? You want them to be creative. You want them to focus on how do I come up with, not sort of like just staring at the wall and coming up with ideas, but how do I actually come up with a process that I follow? How do I have a disciplined approach to coming up with new ideas, testing them out, and actually seeing if they solve someone's problem and then kind of iterating on that ongoing. And I kind of went over very briefly this idea of, you can think of it as a lean startup loop or a fast feedback loop. I always think of it as a small batch process. But again, it's that very disciplined process of every week, let's come up with a feature to implement, let's put it in production, let's observe how people use it and see if it actually solved their problem or not. And I don't know, most organizations don't really seem to do that. So it's not just sort of like, free love and creativity, where you just kind of like have idea walls and mood walls and kind of figure out some new way of doing that. You actually put a very disciplined process in place. And again, management needs to sort of describe that and to some extent enforce people following this process rather than just coming up with their own way of doing it. Now next, I don't know if you've ever tried to do creative, innovative things, but essentially it's all about taking risks, right? Trying out new ideas that probably have a low chance of succeeding, but you do have to figure out a way to make yourself try something new. And there's all sorts of other stuff rotating around what it means to be a risk taker, as far as failure being okay, that we'll get to, and things like that. But if you think about what risk takers do, again, they're not just sort of like cavalier people running around who are missing a few digits on one hand because they've taken too many risks. They're people who have a very, they figured out safety nets, if you will, right? They know they're going to be taking risks, but they want to make sure that they, one, know how to do it, and two, when things go wrong, they can recover from it. And to use a phrase that my friend Andrew Schaefer used once, right? Like, if you're going to learn to surf, you should really know how to swim, right? So if you're going to try to be innovative and try new things out, make sure you have the baseline of knowledge that you need, and you're not just willy-nilly trying things out. And then finally, something that again is often lacking in the existing cultures that we have in IT is being extremely people-centric, not only with yourself and your organization, but the actual users, if you will, that are using your software. And you want to think about, how are we making their life better? Who are these people? What are their needs? And how can we constantly be thinking about them as we're going through that loop to be more innovative? Now, I'll give you a brief example, especially of that last point, that I think is very important. And it kind of explains some other things that leaders try to put into place. And that is in the exciting world of the food service industry, which means companies you go to not only deliver food, but at college campuses or whatever, maybe even the food you'll eat down below. These food service people, they basically do all this food. And we worked with a company a little while ago that had all sorts of kitchens, and their concern was, at the time, was that there's inconsistency in the way that we do our food, and this affects the quality and therefore the customer service, and also the sort of efficiencies that drive profit for us, right? So of course, what we're going to do, clearly what needs to happen, because we're doing digital transformation, is we're going to get recipes and put them on an iPad, and then people won't have all this paper and 3-ring binders, and therefore that will it'll solve our business problem of consistent recipes that are followed, and the world will be a better place. So think about that as some requirements given to a team, right? Take these recipes, put them on an iPad. That people will use in the kitchen. So because these teams were more creative and because they were people-centric, they made themselves get up at 3 a.m. in the morning and actually show up around 4 at these kitchens for quite some time and observe what people were doing, right? They were very people-centric in their attitude for things. And what they saw was that, sure, recipes were a problem, but something that the staff spent most of their time on, or an inordinate amount of time, was checking the temperatures of the mayonnaise and the chicken, right? You've got to make sure that the temperatures don't fall below. And this was an extremely manual, error-prone process, and error-prone's bad, because it's one thing for production to go down, but for to have some shrimp cause death is going to be a pretty fast end to your business. So instead of solving this recipe problem first, because they had discovered this and were experimenting with new things, they came up with a faster way of checking temperatures and solve that problem and remove that, in SRE terms, toil from the process. Now, they were able to move on to doing recipe checking and things like that, but this idea of studying what people want to do instead of just delivering on what the bosses tell you to do is extremely important for what I think we are trying to move to as more of an innovative, a DevOps-y type of culture. Now, I wanted to call out, if you'll notice, I had to crop this so you can see the food. Otherwise, what's he staring at? But you can see he's got a gigantic hat on. And I don't really see these giant chef hats anymore. Now you're wondering, like, how high up does that hat go? It goes up way high. Look at that. Look how happy he is, too. But, like, so maybe you need to have really tall hats in the way you're doing things. But I just wanted to make sure you could see that awesome hat. Plus, I had a lot of spare credits in my Shutterfly account that expire in September, so I needed to get some more art. Now, again, from a leadership position, to support all of that, these are some tools that as a manager you can give your team that I think are very important. So the first one, and you see this, I think this is kind of the current definition of what DevOps is as an idea. It's not just automating your servers and debating about if a DSL is better than Ruby, or like, which container technology is better or not, and if serverless is more important than Docker and blah, blah, blah. All of that stuff, delightful if you're not me. But really what it means is, in the DevOps world, we want to set up these teams that are fully autonomous. They own the service, the product, the software end to end, from a conception of it, to implementing it, to deploying it, to running it. Now, I don't really encounter that many DevOps teams who truly like run everything down to the metal, but that's, I guess, a whole other conversation. But we're going to give these teams complete autonomy. They're going to own that product, right? They're going to be those product managers who, in the same way that at a software vendor, you end up owning the product you have, they have not only the responsibility for it, but they have kind of the parentship of it, if that's a word. And so that autonomy is not easy for most organizations to give teams, because they usually don't really trust their people very well to do a good job with that, right? They assume people will goof off and spend the afternoon doing research on new toe shoes and things like that. Like, they assume they're not really going to be interested in their product enough to actually be given control of that. So figuring out a way and being comfortable with trusting this team as leadership, as managers, becomes another tool, if you will, that you have to wield. And I see this at all the organizations I go to. They tend to not, as they scale up, they don't know all the applications and the teams and the products that they're actually managing. They more are, they kind of have just let them run around on their own. Not to the detriment of making sure they're profitable and fit the business well, but they don't have this kind of micro control over everything. And then also, kind of using that example from the food service industry, you also give the tool of voice to your teams, right? And this definitely seems like a mystic, very comforting kind of teddy bear thing to talk about. But there's, if you think about that example, the team was given the voice to say, no, we're not going to implement this first. We're going to implement something else. And the organization trusted them and let them be autonomous enough to operate. Now, there's a fun literal example you can look at this as well. If you remember, I referenced the military, and there was a picture of one up there. Now, I've never been in the military, but my understanding is that usually you have to ask permission to speak if you're kind of lower in the rank, right? So you really have no voice unless you ask for it and you're given permission for it. And there's kind of a manifestation of that as the Air Force is trying to improve the way they did their software they encountered, and that's a uniform, which basically says, like, this person is in charge, and you don't really have the voice to necessarily question them or essentially speak with them. So as an example of how some organizations give voice, when these teams were forming and looking and starting to work with each other, they had them not wear their uniforms. Now, they wore clothes, but they wore their street clothes instead of the uniforms, and this kind of stripped away that blocker of voice and was a good literal manifestation of, we are giving you voice to speak, and we really welcome you doing that. So again, think of a manager, things you can rely on to actually put that voice in place and give that to people. So I want to go over a few other things. These are more tactics, more tools that leaders can use. And these are some kind of direct things that leaders can do to demonstrate that they're actually serious about setting up those autonomous teams that they trust to be creative. So the first one is kind of a practice that managers can do. And it may be obvious that as a manager, you should delegate work to these teams you're looking to be creative. If they're autonomous and you're giving them voice, you can't sort of micromanage them and second guess them and tell them what to do. You want to give them the training and the practice to figure things out on their own. And again, often this is difficult to managers, and after I don't know, I forget where we were driving from somewhere in Utrecht back home to Amsterdam. I was talking with a guy who worked in an insurance company. And he was saying one of the things managers would start to do is they would force themselves to delegate some important task that was vital to their performance review that quarter or something. So the managers had to train themselves to be comfortable with delegating, but also to demonstrate to their team that they actually could do that and they actually trusted teams to do things. So think about as if you're in a management position, how you can start to demonstrate and practice delegation, which is kind of from a manager's perspective, the other side of autonomy, right? How do I actually demonstrate that and build up that talent, if you will? So then I want to give you a couple of examples of the next two things that I see managers doing to create a better culture, and that is how they give feedback and then also celebrating failure. So last year here, Linda Rising gave a great talk, and I have to admit, I forget if this slide is from it, but it caused me to go look up all of her other talks. And I think it's a good way of thinking about if you want this generative culture, this DevOps culture, how can I give feedback into that system to drive that kind of culture, not necessarily reward it, but tell it if it's going in the right direction. And I think she had a slide about how to do this in business, right? How to change your feedback over. But I think the one that she had about how to talk to your kids, not to be all paternalistic, was actually the best one for a corporate setting. And as you can see, usually the type of feedback that we're used to giving is sort of like, you are a good person, or you are very creative, or you are very skilled at figuring out like outer joins on databases and PSQL, right? And instead, if you're looking for more of this continuous learning, innovative culture, what you want to do is praise the efforts that people went in, the process that they're doing, the decisions that they make, so that they're constantly getting feedback about, I'm changing over to a new way of operating, and I'm figuring that out, right? And so figuring out as a manager how you put that feedback into the system to kind of guide the way people are going through their culture is an important shift that I see managers doing quite a bit. And you can do all sorts of like performance hacking, like OKRs and things like that, which are a fun, clear way of doing things. But really the content that you have in those and the feedback you give into the system is going to be a lot more important than whatever template you follow. So next, there's the idea of blameless postmortems and celebrating failure and all of this. And I think the important part, at least from my stance, of being innovative about blamelessness and failure celebration, again, is that what we're asking people to do when we're asking them to be creative is to constantly learn, to take risks, try new things out, and often it'll fail and they'll have to come up with something new. I mean, it's like what my kids are 5 and 9 years old, and I realized in kind of like studying DevOps over the years that basically what my kids do in school is fail all day long. Despite that, they're very happy at the end of the day, maybe just to get out of school, but really like learning how to write and do, I think as y'all say, maths and your history and things like that. Like it requires constant failure. Like, I don't know about y'all, but like I still don't know how to spell, but I get through life nonetheless. So this kind of failure thing is it's essentially the same as learning. So if your people are afraid of doing that, you're not going to get to this culture that you want. So you often hear that you should have blameless postmortems. Now, if I was told, well, maybe in Pivotal this isn't the case, but in many jobs I've had, if I was told I should stand up at the monthly meeting or the quarterly meeting and talk about some failure that I had and what I learned from it, I would say, oh, I'm on vacation that day, so I won't be able to do that because I enjoy being employed here. And so most people are like that when you're trying to change the culture over. So what management needs to do, probably every single meeting, if only for a few minutes, but definitely for the first, let's say, 6 or 12 months of having these blameless postmortems, is they need to talk about their failures. To, again, as with delegation, build up trust that they actually mean that and it's actually okay to do that. And then also it'll be entertaining to hear about how your bosses screwed up. That's always great fun. But again, a lot of what you're doing is demonstrating that it's actually a good idea and it's highly rewarded to follow these new ways of being creative and innovative to actually be part of that new culture. Now, let's close out by looking at a couple of ways that, especially in large organizations, they get good at scaling what their culture is. Not only establishing it, but maintaining it and keeping it there. Now, the first thing, I used to work in strategy and M&A, so I'm very well versed in how much vacuous nonsense it's full of. But there are some very good tools to use as far as the vision and the strategy that you have around it. And the first one, especially to instilling in those teams the ability to be autonomous and be creative, to have that kind of generative culture you want, is to actually spend a lot of time on figuring out what your actual vision is, why you go about doing things. And this is a great example from a Singapore bank, DBS, and it kind of boils down to basically we want our customers to live more and bank less. So whatever it is you're thinking of doing, figure out how they can spend less time in their banking application. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm not gonna, like, after this, go home and kind of just go hang out with my banking system. Relive all of those exciting transactions we've had over the years, maybe pay a bill. Like, no, I don't really want to use it at all. Maybe I want to know how much money I have, but I want to get on with my life. So figure out how you can put a vision like that in place and spend a lot of time coming up with that so it's meaningful. You know, you don't want to just like, be a market leader, increasing shareholder value and employee morale and satisfaction, which if you want to do that, except for the last two parts, you should be in check cashing. You can make a lot of money just in check cashing, and you don't need to worry about complicated things. Just you're going to get robbed every now and then, but you're always going to make plenty of money. So next, and this is from that book from the GDS people. The other thing that and it often gets codified is to come up, and I sort of think of this as strategy to some extent, without getting in a strategy pedantry argument. But come up with some principles, again, to guide those teams that really go over how you should be thinking about doing things around here, how you should make decisions on a daily basis. And again, what our culture is and how it gets codified in the way we think about things. Now, if you look over these 10 principles, a lot of it is very design-centric and people-centric. But you can start to think, if we scale this up to thousands and thousands of people, if they're following these principles that are pretty easy to communicate and understand, it allows them to operate more autonomously and gets them closer to that kind of creative culture that we want to put in place. Now, so I think there's a couple of other ways of figuring out your strategy and training people up. But one thing in particular that it's good to emphasize, because it seems like a good idea that is costly and time-consuming. But one thing I definitely notice most large organizations doing who have switched over successfully is about on a quarterly basis, for lack of something more precise, they have internal conferences where not only are they talking about here's what our culture is and our principles, and having those blameless postmortems where, again, managers get up and talk about how they've been doing things wrong, and eventually that spreads to other teams. But they have actual product teams, those actual teams in the organizations, giving talks about what they've done and how they're putting this kind of culture in place in these practices. And they can be technological talks and things like that. But you do spend an inordinate amount of time on the broader idea of internal marketing and thinking about how do we share this culture. And it's really worth your time to set aside, at least on a quarterly basis, about a day. You don't want to do like half a day because you're also going to waste the other half of the day. Like, I don't know if you've ever been to a half-day corporate event, but that means that you're just going to leave afterwards and do nothing. But you want to have at least a day, and you probably want to move it around to the different locations you have. But you really think about what's our marketing plan to spread this. And you often see it codified after a couple of years into an actual handbook, like you see from Duke Energy, that will bring those principles together, and also kind of the cultural Bible or manual, if you will. But think about how you actively, especially as management, are spending time and money on the internal marketing and spreading that culture around. Now I'm going to wrap up with just 2 points about the kind of hurdles large organizations often face. And that is, as our friend here is saying, oh, that sounds awesome, but people really don't care, right? They don't really care about having a generative, creative culture, and they really just want to go back to figuring out how to access that SharePoint site and implement all those requirements and just kind of get on with their life. And again, as managers, it's good to think about you have a lot of the responsibility and power to kind of put these fixes into place. So the first one, and I don't know, I think this is still the case. I encounter this distressingly more in Europe than I do back in the States. But oftentimes there'll be other executives. It might be, the boss of the boss, if you will, or a peer. And these executives really don't care about improving things. Sometimes they're older, sometimes they're lazy, sometimes they're just looking for a new job, but they start to be barriers to you actually wanting to fix things up. And so in that case, if you're finding them blockers, one, it's good to isolate them. If you remember that wolf in CIO's clothing, or whichever way the title goes. A lot of it is about that kind of, those kind of tactics. But oftentimes people respond to saving money, right? Like making more money might be good, but most people don't really care about that. But, or I'm saying these kind of people don't care about it. But usually if you can talk about saving money, it's something that everyone responds to. Everyone gets rewarded for that. And so a lot of the efficiencies that you get in this more generative culture, right, actually having software that's useful, following all the huge amount of automation underneath a DevOps stack, that's something you can use to at least isolate these other people who are holding you back. And think about, if you change over to this way of doing things, how will that make things more efficient? How will it make things better? And how does that lead to actual savings that we might have? And so that's one way to remove a barrier to cultural change, especially at the managerial level that you often encounter. Now down at the person level, the individual level, something you often encounter is the, I don't know, self-afflicted old dog problem, right? Like as the text here says, like I'm a crusty old developer, I can't actually change like I do .NET, and I can't do these newfangled things. And what you'll find is that pointing out all these types of people will also be used as an argument for we can't do new things around here. Our staffing is terrible. They're just bad people, which it's kind of a terrible way for a manager to think of their staff. But what you're doing when you're doing your initial projects, let's say your first year of projects, your teams, is you want to make sure not to staff those projects with just, for lack of a better phrase, rock stars or ninjas or whatever the popular phrase is. And instead you want to put, again, I don't know a better word, but you want to put normals on there. Just your crusty developers, and you want to staff, I don't know what the ratio is, half, 50-50 or so, but you staff them with those normal people and also your high performers. And that will often win over the crusty people and show them that it actually is possible for them to change and do things in a good way. But it'll also defeat another counter argument you'll have to cultural change, which is basically like, well, what you did for these first 3 teams is you took all of the high performers from me and the other executives, and you put them all on one team. And if I had all those great people, of course I would have been successful. But now you're asking me to deal with all these crusty people, and they're not going to be successful. You've left me the dregs, again, which is a great way to think about your staff. But it's really important to make sure you're thinking ahead of time for scaling up and thinking about what's the proof that I can put together and the chain of success that I can use to scale this out and expand it to the rest of the organization, so it doesn't seem like a strange anomaly. So finally, just to hit on one last thing, oftentimes it's impossible to change your existing organization. So what companies like these and others do that I've spoken with is they just start up a brand new organization. So they might go to some other building with a lot of pale wood and very well lit rooms, as you can see, lots of toe socks and ways of making coffee. But they'll move one team over there of crusty and uncrusty people, and they'll work on an application. They'll move another team, and slowly they're moving people over to this new organization where you're not beset with the old culture and the old governance models. And again, that may seem very hard for an individual team to do, but it's something that as an executive, I've seen executives are able to do over and over again if they can build up a chain of success. So I've left a few things out of this, and in that book, I cover some of them. One, the role of openness and transparency, which you kind of get to with Blameless postmortems about what a good generative culture is. How you kind of track that, whether it's through employee surveys or other things like that, and the positive effects it has on recruiting. And then finally, the role of money in culture. Now, I found that when people talk about culture change, one of the things they like to say is like, money is the least motivating thing to get people to change what they're doing in their culture. They're interested in doing a good job and things like that. And I feel like the only people who say that are people who don't want to give me money. And so I think there is probably a very important role in the way that money and compensation plays into the way you change your culture. And I don't really read very much about that, other than the obvious that you should reward people who are doing good things. And so I think that's an area that would be interesting to look at more, is the role that the thing we can hopefully all agree on, money, plays in actually putting a good culture in place. So with that, as I mentioned, there's a lot more detail and better case studies or additional case studies on what a good culture looks like, why you would want to change that, and tactics to moving to it, as well as all sorts of other write-ups of what it means to be that organization that's relying on software and thinking in a product mindset to improve its business that you can get from that book and a little bit of the other ones. So I'll be around a little bit afterwards if y'all have any questions, and I'm always happy to talk more on this topic and more. So thanks for having me.